The flight attendant placed a napkin on my tray. Her hands were trembling. Written in hurried ink were the words, "Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now." I stared at her, stunned. Her eyes showed panic, not annoyance or confusion, pure, urgent fear. She leaned close and whispered, "Please, I'm begging you." For a moment, I wondered if it was a prank, a mistake, or something far worse. 2 hours later, what happened made one thing clear. That napkin saved my life. My name is Isella Warren. I'm a 30-year-old travel nurse. I've held dying patients' hands and comforted families for years. After months without a break, I decided to surprise my mom in Boston. She just recovered from heart surgery and always said my voice helped her heal. I couldn't wait to see her face. It was an ordinary afternoon at LAX. People laughed, kids pressed faces to the windows, watching planes taxi, and business travelers typed away. I felt tired but content and said a quiet prayer of thanks that life was steadier. As we boarded, the attendants greeted everyone with practiced smiles. One of them, Alyssa, according to her name tag, was different. She wasn't merely polite, she was watching people closely, scanning faces as if memorizing them. When our eyes met, she hesitated for a beat, like she recognized me, then looked away. I sat near the middle in an aisle seat. Across from me, a man in a black jacket shifted nervously and opened the overhead twice, though he put nothing away. Beside him, a quiet teen hugged his backpack. Nothing obviously wrong, but the pre-flight buzz felt off, a tension under the surface. I texted my sister Chloe, boarded the flight. "Mom has no idea I'm coming. Get ready to film her reaction." She sent heart emojis and reminded me to bring the bakery cookies. Everything seemed normal as I buckled in. Then I noticed Alyssa again. She walked the aisle slowly, pretending to check overhead bins, but her attention was on people. She looked afraid of someone. I couldn't tell who. When she reached my row, she leaned down as if to place a napkin on my tray, never making eye contact. I unfolded it. "You are not safe. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane immediately." My mind went blank. Maybe it was a social experiment. Maybe a mistake. But when I glanced back, Alyssa had stopped at the end of the aisle and turned to lock eyes with me. There was no humor, no confusion, only urgency. My pulse spiked. I looked around. No one else seemed alarmed. I realized I was the only passenger being warned. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't ignore the look in her eyes. If you want to know what happened when I stayed seated and how this flight changed my life, stay with me. And don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. This is a story people need to hear. The napkin felt like a ticking bomb. You are not safe. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane immediately. My instincts urged action, but reason kept me frozen. I glanced back at Alyssa. She stood near the galley, rigid, watching two passengers 3 rows ahead. Her posture was guarded, as if braced for something. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe she slipped the note to the wrong person. Maybe it wasn't for me. Then, briefly, her eyes met mine again, and I saw raw fear. This wasn't a joke. That face meant she was trying to prevent something terrible. I scanned the cabin for odd details. A man in a gray hoodie sat stiffly, gripping the armrest. A businesswoman kept tapping her foot and staring forward instead of reading. The man in the black jacket near the emergency exit, though, felt different. Not anxious, but unnaturally calm and focused. His gaze shifted between the cockpit door and Alyssa, like he expected a cue. I told myself there might be a medical emergency or someone having a breakdown. Then I noticed the overhead bins above first class, sealed with yellow zip ties, something I'd only seen in an in-flight security training video. My nurse instincts told me this was not normal. Something was being contained. Alyssa suddenly approached my row again, pretending to check my seatbelt. She leaned in and, voice barely audible, said, "Do it now. Say you feel faint. If you stay, you will not land alive." I wanted to ask questions, but the expression on her face stopped me. It was fear for me, not for herself. She straightened, offered a mechanical smile, and moved on. My body surged with adrenaline. I reached for the call button, then hesitated. Would calling attention make things worse? What if pretending to be sick triggered whatever danger was coming? My fingers hovered when a loud thud came from the rear, like something heavy dropping. Heads turned. A male flight attendant rushed back, face pale. The teenage boy breathing into his hands looked panicked. Not like fear of flying, but like fear of being found out. He kept whispering, I can't do this. I can't do this, as if forced onto the plane. The engines changed pitch as the plane taxied faster for takeoff. Once airborne, opportunities to intervene would vanish. I watched the terminal slip away and felt certain I had to decide. A text from my sister buzzed. Send me a pic from the plane. I want to post it before Mom sees you. It hit me hard. She had no clue. I typed back, something's wrong. Pray for me. I hit send. As we turned toward the runway, an overwhelming dizziness hit me. Genuine, from fear. My vision blurred, and I realized that doing nothing might be the most dangerous choice. I unbuckled and stood, trembling. Some passengers glared, annoyed at the delay, but I didn't care. As I rose, the man in the black jacket turned toward me slowly. His eyes were cold and assessing, like a predator noting movement in prey. At that moment, Alyssa appeared beside me, placing a steadying hand on my arm, not to restrain, but to guide. Her tone was calm and chilling. Follow me if you want to live. Her hand on my arm looked like assistance, but it felt deliberate. The man in the black jacket feigned a stretch as he stood. Every sense in me heightened. Alyssa guided me forward, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. Ma'am, take deep breaths. We're going to get you water. Then, in a low, urgent whisper as we reached the galley, do not look back. Someone is watching you. Your seat was not assigned by accident. She seated me in the jump seat near the exit door. The male attendant acted as if fetching oxygen while Alyssa quietly said, the person targeting this seat believes you are someone else. If you stay or return, they'll act at cruising altitude. I wondered how my seat could be targeted. A case of mistaken identity? If so, who was meant to sit there? Alyssa slid a small device to her colleague, and they exchanged a subtle signal. As we continued taxiing, she made a call to the cockpit, requesting a return to the gate for a medical escalation. The captain hesitated, then announced a short delay and that we were returning to the gate. The cabin mood shifted. Passengers groaned at the delay, but beneath the protest, I sensed real panic from certain individuals. The man in the black jacket lost his composure. He looked between the cockpit door, me, and the overhead bins, as if recalculating. The teen clutched his backpack and muttered prayers. The businesswoman's hands trembled as she typed furiously. Alyssa positioned herself between me and the aisle, blocking their view as if she knew any sudden move could spark chaos. You need to choose right now, she whispered with a practiced smile. If you get off this plane, your life will be turned upside down. If you stay, you won't get another chance. My chest hammered. I pictured my mother in Boston, expecting to see me in hours. I pictured my sister in her dorm, probably laughing and editing a video about surprising Mom. Then I thought about the fact that if Alyssa was right, my family would never see me again. The plane was already turning back toward the terminal, but we were still moving. If the threat was desperate, they might act before we reached the gate. Alyssa unbuckled and used the intercom. Her tone stayed professional, though I heard a slight tremor as she instructed, "Flight attendants, prepare doors for arrival." The engines slowed and runway lights reflected across the windows. Suddenly, the teenage boy stood up, his face drained. I need to get off this plane. Please, he cried, voice breaking with real terror. Confusion rippled through the cabin. It became clear I wasn't the only one who'd been threatened or warned. Before anyone could react further, the man in the black jacket reached into his carry-on with a deliberate motion. Alyssa stepped forward and raised her hand sharply. Sir, please take your seat, she ordered, but he froze when the cockpit door opened and two uniformed air marshals stepped into the aisle from first class. That's when I realized this wasn't just one crew member acting alone. A federal operation was already active, and somehow I'd been placed at its center. The marshals moved down the aisle, having blended in as regular passengers until that moment. Alyssa looked at me and said quietly but firmly, "You were never the target, but now you are the key." My breath hitched. Everything inside me told me this was the line between my old life and whatever came next. I nodded once and said aloud, steady despite trembling hands, "I want to get off this plane." That sentence sealed it. Alyssa exhaled as if releasing held air and stepped aside, signaling to the marshals. The plane had barely stopped before the marshals secured the aisle and readied an evacuation. I had made my choice. There was no turning back. When the seatbelt signs were still on, two federal marshals advanced with controlled urgency. Passengers, unaware of the real reason for our return, murmured and then grew alarmed as a marshal reached the man in the black jacket's row. Instead of complying, he rose slowly, expression flat, eyes flicking between me, the cockpit, and the approaching marshal. In that instant, his hand slipped into his jacket. The marshal shouted a command, and the man froze, outmaneuvered. But that wasn't the only trigger. Another man near the emergency exit lunged for the door handle. The cabin gasped. A flight attendant blocked him but was shoved back. The teenage boy screamed, "Don't open it. It's not what you think." His voice carried more despair than fear, as if he knew something awful was imminent. Panic spread, people ducked, some shouted, children cried. The businesswoman who had been texting stood and tried to push through, only to be restrained by a second marshal. "You don't understand. It's about to activate," she shouted, face pale. Those words, activate, sent a cold jolt through me. Alyssa, pressing on the intercom, kept her voice firm. "Remain in your seats. Do not touch any overhead compartments." Her calm sounded at odds with her eyes. She stepped aside, and a marshal reached up to a specific overhead bin, the one above where I had originally been assigned. Inside was not luggage, but a sealed wired device the size of a lunchbox with a small blinking light. The cabin fell silent. People stared in disbelief. The man in the black jacket smiled, not triumphant, but satisfied that the truth was exposed. Agents moved quickly. One secured him with zip ties, while another scanned the device without touching it. Alyssa stayed close, watching the suspects, while the teenage boy kept repeating, "It wasn't supposed to be here today. They switched the flight. They switched the target." His voice shook with guilt. He appeared coerced, a witness or someone forced into involvement. The captain emerged from the cockpit, pale, and asked Alyssa, "Is it live?" She nodded grimly. My heart dropped when she then told me the device had been placed under seat 14C, my seat. I had been assigned 14C that morning, after changing to an earlier flight to surprise my mother. My seat change had not been random. It had been intercepted. If I hadn't received that napkin, if I'd stayed in my seat, if Alyssa hadn't noticed the switch, I wouldn't be here. As law enforcement evacuated passengers row by row, the businesswoman kept yelling that the device was remotely triggered and that someone on the ground would activate it. Marshals alerted ground control. Emergency units surrounded the plane. Everyone was rushed out through the rear door, the farthest from the device. When my turn came, Alyssa put a steady hand on my shoulder and explained quietly. It wasn't about me personally. They'd expected a federal informant in my seat, someone with sensitive documents traveling under protection. That person had canceled at the last minute, and I had boarded in their place without knowing. The attack was meant to look like an aviation accident, covering a political assassination. As we stepped onto the jet bridge, I saw men in tactical gear running down the terminal. There was shouting and people running. The teenage boy, now in custody, looked back with tears and muttered, "They said no one would know. They said no one would get hurt except the target." It became clear this was a calculated operation, not random violence. I had nearly been on every news broadcast as the victim of a mid-air attack just as I entered the terminal. My phone, still in airplane mode, buzzed the moment it reconnected. Texts from my mother and sister, missed calls, unknown numbers. A voicemail played from an unfamiliar number. A distorted voice said, "We know you got off the plane. This is not over." In that instant, I realized I wasn't only a survivor. I'd been pulled into a conflict I hadn't asked for, and those who planned this weren't finished with me. Standing in the terminal among flashing lights, federal agents, and shaken passengers, every sound felt distant. The voicemail kept echoing. "This is not over." My hands trembled, not only from the close call, but from the knowledge that I'd stepped into something much larger. A female agent approached with firmness and compassion, saying I'd be taken to a secure holding area. She explained the suspects were part of a domestic extremist group planning attacks disguised as aviation accidents. They had targeted a federal whistleblower traveling under a protected identity. That whistleblower had canceled, and my seat was the one chosen for the attack. Then it hit me. I was alive because a woman I'd never met acted on instinct instead of routine. If Alyssa had ignored her gut, if she'd overlooked the seating change, if she'd been a minute slower, I would have been a headline, not a living person telling this story. As federal agents led me away, I passed families embracing, passengers crying with relief, and others demanding answers. Their travel plans were ruined, but those inconveniences had saved lives. I was escorted to a private room where I saw Alyssa again. She no longer looked like a composed flight attendant. She was an undercover federal agent. That napkin had been the first step in saving hundreds of lives that day. When our eyes met, I broke down. Not from fear, but from gratitude. She came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I need you to know something," she said softly. "You were never supposed to be in danger. But when I saw your face, I knew you were strong enough to hear the truth." Her words settled in me. All my life, I'd been the one helping others. Patients, families, strangers in crisis. But that day, I had to rely on someone else. Over the next hours, I gave a statement and learned more. The teenage boy had been coerced and tried to signal distress by clutching his backpack. The woman in the business suit was actually an embedded agent from another unit, monitoring suspects from a different angle. Multiple agencies had tracked the operation for weeks. The decision to stop the flight wasn't random. It was triggered the moment Alyssa slipped me that napkin. Because I reacted, because I moved, because I didn't ignore the signs, I survived. What I took for panic became protection. What I saw as fear became clarity. That night, I was taken to a secure hotel under federal protection and lay awake as my flooded with messages about a major threat prevented at LAX. My sister called on a protected line, sobbing with relief. My mother's voice broke hearing mine. Tears fell as I grasped how close I'd come to never hearing them again. I expected to feel broken or weak, but instead I felt a surprising purpose. If that had been my last day, I would have left without telling the world what I'd learned. Danger often hides in ordinary moments, and a single warning can save a life if you listen. In the days that followed, I cooperated as authorities dismantled the broader network. My full story wasn't released to the public because investigations continued, but the experience changed my life. I stopped living passively and began paying close attention, not from fear, but with awareness. I promised myself I'd never dismiss instincts or ignore the signals others give. Today I share this because sometimes your life depends on a choice you didn't expect to make. You may never get a napkin with a warning, but you might feel uneasy, notice something off, or hear a voice inside telling you to act. Don't ignore it. Your instinct isn't panic, it's protection. Sometimes that protection comes as a stranger begging you to listen. If this story made you feel grateful or opened your eyes, please subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. Your comment could remind someone to pay attention, and that reminder might save a life.